Welcome to HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Overviews. This video will discuss payment standards. Today we hope you learn a bit more about what payment standards are, considerations PHAs make when setting their payment standards, and how the amount of the payment standard impacts how much HCV families pay toward rent. Before we dive in, though, let's have a brief refresher on Housing Choice Vouchers. A housing choice voucher enables a family to lease a unit of their choosing in the private market. The program's objective is to provide decent, safe, and affordable shelter to low-income families. Families have the flexibility to select the community or neighborhood where they want to live. The family's share of rent is typically based on their adjusted monthly income. The PHA pays the remaining share to the landlord up to a certain amount, which is called the payment standard. Each PHA establishes their own payment standards. What is a payment standard? The HCV program has limits on how much subsidy it can pay for a rental unit. The rent charged to a family must always be reasonable, and the payment standard is the maximum monthly assistance payment for a family assisted in the voucher program, before deducting the total tenant payment by the family. The PHA publishes a listing of payment standards by bedroom size, known as the Payment Standard Schedule. When determining what payment standard is applicable for a family, the PHA must use the payment standard for the lower of the family unit size listed on their voucher, or the size of the unit leased by the family. To determine how much the payment standard is, each PHA must use HUD's fair market rent, or FMR. What is a fair market rent? Each year, HUD publishes fair market rents for areas all across the country. These are intended to represent the cost to rent a moderately priced dwelling unit in the local housing market. HUD determines the FMR by looking at the rents paid by people who've recently moved in a given FMR area. They then determine the 40th percentile of rents paid by recent movers in a given FMR area and set the fair market rent at that amount. This means that 40% of the units in the area rented for less than the set FMR amount. Therefore, FMR is slightly lower than the median rents for the area. For most PHAs, HUD sets FMRs at the metropolitan area. But in some markets, HUD has published FMRs at the zip code level instead of one FMR for the entire metropolitan area. Basing FMRs on rents within zip codes rather than by the larger metropolitan area allows for more precise and accurate FMRs and thus payment standards. By using this more granular calculation, designated small area fair market rents, small area FMRs, PHAs can expand the number of neighborhoods with units that are affordable and accessible to voucher holders. PHAs set their payment standards anywhere from 90% to 110% of FMR, or small area FMR, as applicable, which is known as the basic range. However, HUD has numerous options for PHAs that find the basic range does not meet their programmatic goals. One option is available to all PHAs that are in an area with a published small area FMR. If the PHA's FMR is lower than the small area FMR in any zip code, the PHA may adopt the small area FMR for that zip code. This just requires an email notification to HUD. In addition to the small area FMR option, or for PHAs that are not in an area with a published small area FMR, they may request HUD approval of payment standard amounts higher or lower than the established FMR for designated parts of the FMR area. We call these exception areas or exception payment standards. HUD will only approve exception payment standard amounts if they're needed to help families find housing outside areas of high poverty concentrations, or because voucher holders have trouble finding housing to lease under the program. In certain situations, a PHA may receive HUD approval to increase the payment standard up to 120% of FMR or even higher. Each year when HUD publishes the FMRs, PHAs will want to evaluate whether the basic range is adequate for meeting their programmatic goals, or whether they should consider one of the exception payment standard options to adopt payment standards outside of the basic range. In setting payment standards, the PHA's goal is to strike a balance between helping more families, maximizing the number of families that can be assisted, and helping families more, assuring that the subsidy makes housing an affordable component of a low-income family's budget. HUD has made some helpful tools available to support PHAs in analyzing the impact of changing payment standards on their program. HUD's 2-year tool can help the PHA examine the impact of payment standards and other leasing and spending decisions on the PHA's HCV program. When thinking about setting payment standards, PHAs should consider what happens if the payment standards are too low. Families may be forced to spend more than 30% of their income for rent and may have difficulty affording necessities such as food, clothing, transportation, and medical care. Families spending more than 30% of their income for rent are considered to be rent burdened. Families may have a hard time finding acceptable units or units in more desirable areas. Housing choices will be narrowed, and the PHA's efforts to affirmatively further fair housing could be undermined. However, there is a trade-off if the payment standard is too high. The PHA may not be housing as many families as it could with its current program budget. $1 spent to reduce rent burden is $1 less the PHA has to house another family, just as $1 spent housing an additional family is $1 less to lower the participant's rent burden. In setting its payment standard, a PHA needs to find the sweet spot that makes it possible for families to be competitive in the rental market without being rent burdened. HUD provides the payment standard tool to assist PHAs in understanding programmatic effects of payment standard changes on the rent burden and per unit cost. We'll now look at a few examples where we can see how the effects of setting a higher or lower payment standard can impact the rent payments of families. Before we do, let's review a few terms that we'll be using in these examples, just to make sure we're all familiar with the terminology. The first term is total tenant payment, or TTP. This is the family's minimum share of the rent. The TTP is calculated as the greater of 30% of the family's adjusted monthly income, 10% of monthly income, welfare rent from a public agency, the part of welfare specifically designated to meet the family's actual housing cost, or the minimum rent set by the PHA. A family may lease a unit where their rent payment is more than their TTP. However, a PHA may not approve a unit for which the family share would exceed 40% of the monthly adjusted income at initial move. The next term is gross rent. The gross rent is the sum of the contract rent for the unit plus an allowance for family-paid utilities called the utility allowance. The utility allowance is based on a schedule set by the PHA. This schedule is based on the monthly cost of a reasonable consumption of utilities and other services for the unit by an energy-conservative household of modest circumstances consistent with the requirements of a safe, sanitary, and healthful living environment. The utility allowance is added to the contract rent when the cost of utilities, except telephone, and other housing services for an assisted unit are not included in the family rent, but is the responsibility of the family occupying the unit. If the gross rent for the unit is higher than the payment standard, the family is responsible for the difference. So we've covered TTP and gross rent, and now we're going to talk about housing assistance payments, or HAP. The HAP is the actual amount that the landlord will receive from the PHA. A PHA's housing assistance payment is determined by subtracting the total tenant payment from either the gross rent or the payment standard, whichever is lower. If the gross rent for the unit is higher than the payment standard, the family share will be the TTP plus the amount by which the gross rent exceeds the payment standard. As mentioned, if this amount is greater than 40% of the family's monthly adjusted income at initial move, the family will be above the allowable threshold, and therefore the family cannot move into that unit. Let's look at an example family to see how the variations in the payment standard affect what the family pays and what the PHA pays. In this example, we see the fair market rents by bedroom size for a PHA that administers a voucher program. For the purposes of the examples we're going to walk through, we'll just be looking at 2-bedroom unit size. As you can see in the chart, the fair market rent for this size unit is $1,311. Underneath the FMR section, the payment standards within the basic range is displayed at 90% of fair market rent calculation and the 110% of FMR. When we look at what the payment standard would be at 90% of the FMR, it is $1,180. If it were set at 110% of the FMR, it would be $1,442. We're now going to look at 3 scenarios where we apply payment standards set at different percentages of the FMR. In all 3 examples, the family has an adjusted monthly income of $830. Their TTP is $249. The contract rent is $1,250 and the utility allowance is $60 per month. The gross rent for the unit is $1,310. In the first scenario, the payment standard is set at 90% of FMR, or $1,180 per month. A family finds a 2-bedroom unit to call home with a contract rent of $1,250 and a utility allowance of $60 per month, bringing the gross rent to $1,310. The PHA will then take the lower of the gross rent, $1,310, or the payment standard, $1,180, to calculate the housing assistance payment, which in this case is the payment standard. The $1,180 payment standard minus the total tenant payment of $249 equals $931, the amount the PHA will pay. The family will pay the remaining $379, or 45.7% of monthly adjusted gross income. In this case, 45.7% is above the allowable threshold for a family share at initial move. In the second scenario, we have the same family paying the same $1,310 in gross rent, but the payment standard is set at 98%, or $1,285 per month. In this case, to calculate the HAP, we will again use the payment standard as it's lower than the gross rent, which means the family will pay any amount above the HAP. The $1,285 payment standard minus the total tenant payment of $249 gives us the PHA's amount of $1,036. The family will pay the remaining $274, or 33% of their monthly adjusted gross income. In our third example, the payment standard is set at 110%, or $1,442. Gross rent is again $1,310, which is lower than the 110% payment standard of $1,442. In this case, we will subtract TTP from gross rent to calculate the PHA housing assistance payment of $1,061. Since the gross rent for the unit is lower than the payment standard, the family share will be the TTP, or $249, which is exactly 30% of their adjusted monthly income. When we compare these 3 scenarios, we can see how the effects of what the PHA chose as their payment standard impact whether a unit found by the family can be approved for the program and how affordable the rent actually is to the family. We can also see how these variations in payment standards affect what the PHA pays compared to how much a family pays. How does a PHA determine if its payment standard is adequate? So, now that we see how important the payment standard is, what should a PHA be thinking about as they go to establish their payment standards each year? HUD publishes new FMRs every year, usually around August or so. HUD requires that prior to the effective date of any new FMRs, the PHA must review its payment standard schedule and amend it as needed to ensure that the payment standards remain within the basic range, which is again 90% to 110% of the new FMR. In addition to ensuring that the payment standards set by the PHA are within the basic range, PHAs also should determine if its payment standards are adequate overall and for each unit size. Several factors should be considered when the PHA is reviewing the adequacy of its payment standards. These include an analysis of rent burden, availability of rental units below the payment standard, average time to lease a unit, and how often families with vouchers are unable to lease a unit. First, the PHA should review the rent burden in the program, not only at the program level, but also at the voucher size and, if applicable, area level. This means the PHA looks at the number and percentage of families that are paying more than 30% of their adjusted annual income in rent, which is the threshold for determining if a family is rent burdened. In cases where more than 40% of families are rent burdened at each voucher bedroom level, HUD has the authority to require an increase in payment standards. Second, the PHA should review its rent reasonableness data, vacancy rate data, and other rental market-related information to determine whether there is an ample supply of vacant units with rents below payment standards, particularly in areas with low concentrations of poor and minority families. A PHA may also want to review its subsidy standards as it relates to the type of units available in the market. Subsidy standards, or more commonly known as the voucher size, are the PHA's determination of the number of bedrooms needed for families of different sizes and compositions. Third, the PHA should look at the average time it's taking voucher holders to find a unit. If the average time required for voucher holders to find units is excessive, for example, 90 days or longer, an increase in the payment standard may be needed. And finally, the PHA should also review the number of voucher holders whose vouchers expire without having leased a unit. While some barriers to leasing are to be expected, the fact that there are a substantial number of families unable to lease units with assistance under the HCV program suggests that the payment standards may be too low. This concludes the presentation on HUD's payment standards. Please check out the full series of webinars to learn more about the basics of Housing Voucher Program. You can find those webinars at the following web address.